Hi, this is Jason Curran. This is my presentation of Pittance Per Child, the effect of charter school policies on student outcomes. So, overview, I have a charter school policy summary, literature review, policy analysis, policy recommendations, moving forward, and conclusion. So, the modern charter school really began in 1990s Minnesota. Um, that's not when it really began. Like, there's been movements, as I'll talk about later, since the 70s in order to take education into the people's hands rather than the public's or the community's hands. It's ubiquitous across America now. It's everywhere, from California to NOLA to New York to the Delta. It's everywhere. Not only is it everywhere, it's diverse both in practice and theory, and it's why that we have a large spread of whether it's effective or not. It has an undeniable community impact, positive and negative, um, and I'm going to be talking about both. So it really started because of public school failure. Um, that doesn't mean that charter schools are perfect. It doesn't mean public schools are perfect when I talk about the failings of charter schools. But it was a reaction to public school inequality, as we've talked about in the class. Funding, housing, demographics. For example, in Arkansas, schools funding is based off local property taxes. So the rich schools get rich and the poor schools get poor. Right? Like if you're in Mariana, your local property taxes is squat because public income is most of the area has government housing, rent is dirt cheap, taxes is incredibly low. The demographics, because things are based on poverty line and things are based on housing lines, is also incredibly black and white as well. You'll have large school districts where, like North Little Rock, where you have a black school near more the urban centers and the wider, richer schools on the outskirts and the suburbs. Um, so public schools had failed before charter schools even tried. Um, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So first, let's start with the literature review. The literature review really said kind of what I said with the public, but it also showed that there's two sides of the argument. Some people think charter schools are terrible, and some think they're wonderful. Now, the people who think they're wonderful are actually like sometimes the groups are very similar. The people who think they're wonderful sometimes are people who are tired of public education inequality. Even as far back as the 70s, minority groups were trying to take education back into their own hands because of larger school districts underfunding them. When you have a school board that looks nothing like you making decisions on funding and stuff for your school district and for your particular high school, that is incredibly inequitable. You want to take control. And so people did with private schools and with different urban schools in New York. Over the years, by the 1990s, I switched to public charter schools, which spread quickly across the nation and to California. And in California, they've had a lot of success. But that's because people are held accountable to their charters, which is often not the case. Some of the complaints about charter schools are that they have very low diversity. Their demographics are generally one color. Also, that I'll go to the next slide. Also, that they have high turnover, which lowers student outcomes. You have high teacher turnover, you have high principal turnover, you have high student turnover. There's just so many people going in and out. And this is actually reflected in my own school. I often have kids come from the local charter to my school. I often have kids leave my school and go to the local charter and be back by the end of the year. These kipsters who are no longer kipsters. I'll talk about them in the second too. So policy. First, I want to talk about barriers to access. First, to even go to a KIP, and especially if you're in a rural community, it's not as easy to go to the public school. Public schools, you get out of the house, your parents don't have to help you. You go to the stop sign, you go to school, right? And the bus picks you up. Or you can even walk there in some cases. With charter schools, for example, KIP, you have one KIP school doing the entire Delta. And yeah, we have this KIP bus go through our county, but it stops at one area. Your parent generally has to drive you. And if they can't afford gas, if they can't afford to drive you, if they work two jobs, they're not going to drop you off. So actually, the only kids who are getting to go are the kids who are privileged enough to go. This creates an illusion of school choice. Like, people should get to go wherever they want. But lots of poor people don't, right? They can't, like, if they're working a night shift, if they're working two jobs, if they can't afford gas, they can't afford to choose. They have the public schools. And so all the school choice does is help people who are already more privileged. This creates a troubling dichotomy, the haves and the have-nots. You have the high-achieving students, typically more privileged, go to the charter schools. You have the have-nots, the poor, parents can't afford gas or work multiple jobs, go to the public schools. Or you have the kids who get kicked out, right? I had a little girl come into my class who apparently had caught the bathroom at KIP on fire. She had started a fire in a garbage can. She came back, right? Got kicked out of KIP. I have kids who can't keep their grades, so they come back to Lee. I have kids who just had gotten a fight, so they got kicked out of KIP and they go back to Lee. Like, there is so little attempt to keep people there, right? That's the problem. They have, as talked about in the literature review, they have so high turnover. So, charter school policy recommendations. First, charter schools should be tied to community outcomes. What I mean by that is that if a charter school comes in and they aren't doing, if the school district, let's say, has an 18 ACT average, and the charter school comes in, and when they come in, the charter school's average is like a 21. That needs to be re-examined, because even though the charter school might be keeping its charter, it might be doing this by things like kicking out students who are low achieving, right? Oh, that student comes in with a 13. Well, he has D's and F's. Let's just kick him out and send him back to the public school. And suddenly our average isn't decreased. So instead of just looking at the charter school's outcome, cognitive outcome, you need to look at the entire district's outcomes. So if the charter school goes up to a 21, but the public school goes down to like a 16 from that 18, that charter school didn't help squat. It's not helpful. It's not useful, especially because the public school is larger, right? It's a bigger district. And so when it drops significantly, that's actually a worse impact. That's a more meaningful negative impact than it's a positive one. Also, it should be tied to non-cognitive ratings as well. The school charters should be tied to non-cognitive ratings as well. Things like turnover, right? If there's high turnover, that's problematic. Students need stability. So there should be a non-cognitive ratings, things like attendance, right? The student showing up every day. Next, accountability. Currently, at least in Arkansas, charters are renewed every 5 years, but often they're not even held accountable to it. They're often allowed to continue even when not meeting growth expectations. For example, Lighthouse Pine Bluff, which is owned by an organization owned by a middle-aged white woman and her Walmart compatriots, was recently, I guess not recently anymore, 2 years ago, didn't meet its charter. It had high turnover. It didn't have a lot of students, terrible test scores, terrible rating. So the state board voted on whether it should still exist because it hadn't met a charter by a vote of 3-2. It did. It continued to exist. So it didn't need to meet its charter. It didn't need to do anything, right? It just kept on trucking, making money for the 1%. And that's the worst of charter schools. When all they exist, when the only reason they exist is to make money for a couple of people. That's often what happens when we privatize education. So, moving forward, awareness of legislation, awareness of what charter schools get passed and why. Things like Little Rock being taken over and 8 failing schools went to 22 as charter schools got okayed across the board by the state board. Um, Also, I'm getting my PhD in education policy. Hopefully, I'll learn more about this and learn how to combat it. So, just in conclusion, positive and negatives on both sides for charter schools. Policy should be amended just to hold schools more accountable and hold organizations more accountable to student outcomes, to make it more acceptable. Thank you.